All right. Hello, everyone. It's August 12th, 2022, and we are in GuestStream number 26.1, From Users to Sense Makers, on the pivotal role of Stigmergic social annotation in the quest for collective sense making. This should be a great presentation and discussion, and so I'll pass it to Ronen to introduce the context and take it away with the presentation. So thanks everyone for joining, and Ronen and Will, thanks for coming on.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks Daniel for putting this on, and yeah, excited to be here and have this discussion. I think it's our first time discussing this paper in like long form, so looking forward to it. So yeah, this paper actually, so yeah, for some context, this presentation will be related to the paper that we wrote together as a group. And yeah, it was also presented in a conference on hypertext and social media in June of this year in Barcelona. So today we'll go over kind of the key points of the paper and try to dive into more details, kind of explore directions that we didn't maybe have time to address in the sort of short kind of presentation debate over the paper at the conference. And then we'll later sort of open a wider discussion, talk about how this is sort of informing the work of our collective, and a discussion of some initial projects that we're working on in the context of this research, including active inference and some other projects like VO and a few more. So yeah, looking forward to a lot to talk about. So yeah, probably we should start with the definitions of some of the terms we're going to be using in this, because we introduce a lot of words that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So I think, yeah, sense making is something that has a lot of different definitions. The one we're sort of working with, working definition, we're looking at processes by which individuals and groups make sense of their environment by organizing sense data until the environment is understood well enough to enable reasonable decisions. So we do sense making all the time in physical environments and online environments, as we'll see. So there's this kind of incoming stream of sense data coming from the environment, and we have to sort of adapt and yeah, handle this kind of stream of data to inform our decisions, incorporate it sort of into our decision-making process. But yeah, so sense making is a kind of fraught subject in terms of like where collective sense making comes into play, because there's this kind of feeling, or there's you'll hear a lot of people talking about how democracies are in danger, and they make reference to sense making, some kind of a kind of typical sort of thing you might hear from media. You'll hear things like this quote we brought here. So yeah, the quality of our democratic life depends on the public having the facts and being able to make sense of them. And there's this feeling that this isn't really happening anymore. So that's why a lot of people are worried about the future of democracy. This is just kind of an interesting research here on the right that's showing how polarized and how much we don't have a shared sense of what's going on. So you can look at things like the topics people are looking at and seeing on CNN or Fox News, and see like how different the coverage is of each of those networks for the same topic. So yeah, so things like Trump's failures will get a lot of being addressed like very heavily on CNN, but not seeing much on Fox, and then vice versa with like Biden and Democrats. So yeah, people are living in really different worlds, and this is because of our information environments. So this is kind of the motivating background for why we're getting interested in this, because really our democracies are at stake, as a lot of people have already noticed. And yeah, just kind of another word of sort of disclaiming that sense making is a wicked problem. And yeah, we definitely aren't going to claim to have like the solution to sense making or collective sense making. It will require many different solutions, and it's kind of an ongoing problem. So we'll kind of make progress on it, and then we'll have new problems as we make progress. It's very interdisciplinary, so there's a lot of stakeholders, a lot of different sort of schools of thought that and practice that will need to be involved. So we're trying to look at one angle that we think is a really important one, and that is how platforms shape our information landscapes online. And we kind of noticed two things, two sort of important things about platforms that make them what we call perilous. So for one, there's this notion of centralization where a few giant platforms, Facebook, Google, YouTube, etc., have gained unprecedented control over attention by controlling the means to create, search, and distribute information. And two, opacity, where platforms, network data, and algorithms are hidden away from the public. So there's like all the sort of oversight that could help us address issues with our information landscape are really not. We don't really have any way to handle this currently because of this opacity. The kind of doom scrolling has become the icon of our times, and we don't know what's behind our screens. Like, why is something being shown to us? We kind of have at times vague or less vague different motivation for why that might be. But yeah, we really are kind of they're controlling our screens, and we're on those screens for most of the day. So definitely a lot of power over what our information diets. So it's clear how we got here, right? Because it's kind of convenient. We have these platforms, and TikTok and Twitter. They do offer us like very high quality in some regards. Like they give us information that we're interested in. We like seeing what we're looking at on Instagram. We like seeing the videos we're watching on TikTok. They give us like this short-term dopamine kick. But of course, then when we look at sort of the more global picture, we can sort of start seeing the costs of this. Platforms are involved in a host of deeply problematic social phenomena like polarization, misinformation, epistemic distraction. And yeah, it's interesting to sort of go into the literature, like scientific literature on this, because scientists, this is just one tweet that I remember in particular. The most important paper of my career talking about this kind of dramatic restructuring of the human communication in the span of the decade, brought by these platforms with no aim other than selling ads. The paper is called Stewardship of Global Collective Behavior. It's a very inspiring call to action. This is a crisis discipline, just like ecology and sustainability are crisis disciplines. We need to understand how we're going to help save the planet from ruining nature. So we have a similar kind of crisis that they're sort of claiming on the front of on the front of like the information online environments that people are living in. So so there's been a lot of work on this. So this is on the scientific side. This book is another kind of interesting, very inspiring book that also kind of puts the finger squarely on this kind of challenging attention economy. That says that if we're going to surmount the formidable challenges we face today, we'll need to be giving the right sort of attention, the right sort of things. The book is called Stand Out of Your Light. It talks about freedom and resistance to the attention economy. And these are all very inspiring sort of works. And the question is, where do we go from here? So we're really inspired, and we understand that the information environments are very sort of putting us in this perilous spot. But what can we do? So this is also from the same book. We're kind of working towards where we can start to actually be doing work on helping rethink these information environments. So our quest kind of begins with this kind of realization, and again, this is from the same book we presented earlier. If we're at all serious about promoting freedom and autonomy in the digital age, what that would entail is starting to assert and defend our freedom of attention. And this is also a very evocative kind of passage, freedom of attention. What does that look like on online spaces? There's a lot of ways we can think about freedom of attention. So a lot of this work is sort of, I think, an attempt to sort of articulate one vision of what freedom of attention looks like online. So we have this quest. We're trying to sort of put this then more concrete words, what it means, freedom of attention. We still don't really have a sort of concrete target, which is what we're working towards in this building up some tension. But as a spoiler, what we'll be talking about in this presentation, what we talked about in the paper, we take Stigmergic to be some kind of unifying concept that's underlying attention and Sensemaking. So if we need some place to start, sort of a concrete, solid place to put our feet and start working, We think Stigmergy is a really useful concept. Many of you probably haven't even heard of Stigmergy. I surely haven't until I met Daniel here. I learned about collective intelligence in insects. So we'll start from ground zero. Stigmergy is collective behavioral coordination among entities via perception and modification of shared environment. And this, I think, really did originate in studies of coordination in ants. So the classic sort of example is trail pheromones that ants leave, and we'll go into more detail on that. So an ant leaves some kind of environment modification in the form of a trail pheromone, and then other ants are attracted to it, and there's some of this collective intelligent behavior emerging as a result. Another important thing to say about Stigmergy is this is on the next slide. Yeah, so Stigmergy is really kind of profound when you go into it, because we shape the environment and it shapes us in a very profound way. Some even go as far as to say that environments act as a distributed memory system for a collective organism. So if any of you are familiar with the extended mind hypothesis in cognitive science, how our tools are sort of extensions of our cognition. So Stigmergy is a sort of extended mind for collectives. And then we have these Stigmergic feedback loops where, I can go back here, we have agents and they're producing some kind of mark. That's where stigma in Greek, mark is coming from. So agents are producing these results of action, and that's stimulating the same agent or other agents. And so there's this kind of coupling between the environment, the agent acting on the environment, stimulating other agents for action, and then this kind of emergent global sense. Also important, no large-scale coordination is possible without Stigmergy. So if you go above n equals 25, then you need Stigmergic communication. It's not like we can do Zoom calls with 1,000 people, right? We need other methods of coordination. Stigmergy is this main method of doing it. Asynchronous, modifying environments that other people are participating in. We'll go through a lot of examples, but the point is that we really need to create healthy Stigmergic infrastructure for large-scale coordination. And then, we can ask, is the Stigmergic infrastructure that is provided to us today in online environments, how healthy is it? So we'll talk about that in a minute. Daniel, do you have anything you wanted to say about other aspects of Stigmergy that we may or may not be touching here, or is maybe later?
On the types of Stigmergy, yes.
Cool. So that's our next slide. We took a lot of inspiration from this work by Leslie Marsh and Christian Onoff, Stigmergic epistemology. And they give this kind of useful distinction between two kinds of Stigmergy. And you have content-creating Stigmergy. They call it sematectonic, I think. They're drawn from some other literature, I think. Oh, cool. Acts as assignability, because I wasn't sure that actually. Nice. So content-creating Stigmergy versus signaling Stigmergy, which is marker-based. So the examples are helpful here in understanding what they each mean. In a physical environment, content creating is actually carving out a trail, which other agents are going to see and use that. They take that as some kind of sign that we should go on this trail and not just randomly off into the woods. And in a digital environment, you might think of things like writing a document. So you're actually modifying the digital environment by writing words. So that's kind of the content creating Stigmergy. And on the other side, you have signaling Stigmergy, the marker-based, where looking at things like pheromone trails in the physical environment. So ants aren't actually modifying the environment in any sort of meaningful way. I mean, they're just doing it as sort of communication mechanism. They're not changing the environment by moving some debris out of the path or creating some new path, or just marking some kind of trail for other ants. In the digital environment, you can think of a sort of highlighting or tagging is the counterpart to that in the physical environment. So we'll definitely go into this also more in detail. Now, we are focusing here on this signaling-based Stigmergy. We kind of isolate that as this is what we want to focus on, because actually, this doesn't get as much attention if you're thinking about online environments, as we'll see. A lot of people are talking about this kind of content creating Stigmergy. It sort of people don't mention it in Stigmergic, but people are talking about how we create content, how we share it online, and not as many people are talking about it's kind of how we're sharing markers online. So this is why we decided this is kind of an important thing to focus on and bring to attention. Yeah, and did you want to say something else about types of Stigmergic?
Yeah. In the physical case, the left side, the actions that modify the niche and clear out the trail or move pebbles and do the nest architecture and so on, the analogy to content creation is very clear. Like there's some arrangement of mass that isn't where it was previously. And then on the right side, where in the physical case, it's more like the pheromone trails, which are transient or longer lasting accumulations. And as I hope we can draw out on the next slide and going forward, there is this kind of accumulation across both types. Like somebody might make an initial post on a social media, but then somebody else might annotate it and it blurs the line between what is a reaction, what's a pheromone, and what is like building another piece of content. Like if somebody responds with a image, is that like building or is that like annotating and marking? And I think that points to the need to have a design language and a way of framing this question that is able to encompass like the pure classical content delivery, like a paper publication, and pure classical transient marking on some digital context and everything in between, so that we don't have to categorize different communication acts along the lines that they've been defined by essentially the platforms that got us into this position.
Yeah. No, that's really great. And I think here, this maybe creates a misleading impression that there's some kind of categorization, it's like a taxonomy, but yeah, there's really a spectrum between marker-based and content creating. So it's kind of there's all the gray areas in between, and some markers are almost content in their own right. If I add a highlight with some words on it, is that really content creating, or is that more an annotation, or like signaling? So yeah, definitely a lot of spectrum here, and this is just to say that we're focused more on this side of the spectrum, and really we can talk about this side of the spectrum, give a better idea of what we're looking at. So we're looking at Stigmergic markers on the web, and the reason we're focused on them is because in a lot of respects, they function as sort of the digital traces of human attention. And you're looking at things like reactions, associations that people might make, hyperlinks, like, oh, I think this content relates to some other content. We do it all the time. Like we, in our tools like Notion, you're linking to some other page you think this reminds you of. Tags, tagging content, saying, oh, this is on the topic of, I don't know, this decentralized distance or something like that. And click-through data is interesting. This is an implicit, right? Yeah, an explicit and an implicit markers. So some of these markers, people are kind of doing this. They're leaving consciously the digital pheromone trail by liking some posts. And other times, it's actually like you can think of it as an implicit marker, where it's just like the trail that we're traveling on the web. We're leaving this marker, and it is definitely being harvested, right? Like click-through data is very valuable data that as we'll see also later, platforms are selling and hoarding. But yeah, there's the difference in like what people might not think they're even creating any kind of data here, even though people today are more sort of aware of it. But I think there's a lot of these are some interesting future directions if we're talking about like implicit versus explicit. So there might be things that are more implicit, in the future, for example, pupil measurements or gaze tracking, brain-computer interfaces. So this is just, where you're looking on a screen could also be a Stigmergic marker, given that someone is recording it. It's getting recorded in some kind of medium and being used to sort of guide someone else's attention. Yes, then that is a Stigmergic marker. If no one is recording it, then you could say, it's not actually a Stigmergic marker. There are definitely, there's a few things to say about this. One is that the reason these markers are so important is because they're very cheap to create, but they have a very high information content. So this is why, machine learning researchers and practitioners will pay a lot of money for human annotated data. And annotation is like it can be, a few bits of information. What label is some category, but it's very high information content because the human looked at this picture and decided, okay, this is a dog or this is a cat. So these things are very high information content, and that makes them very valuable. And they're also cheap to create and interpret. So yeah, this makes markers very valuable, but it also creates kind of challenges with ethics, user consent, how the data is being used, privacy, because this thing is very valuable, but on the other hand, we're also creating a lot of it without even thinking. So should this be ours or should it not be ours? So a lot of questions there. Cool. So we're getting closer now to sort of understanding where our quest is going. So yeah, Stigmergic markers could be harnessed for healthier collective sense making, but centralized platforms are guarding them. Now we kind of can see that if we look now, everywhere we look at what platforms are doing, we can see that they're actually these dragons that are hoarding Stigmergic markers. Like everything we're doing is getting really recorded without us having much access to it. So the click-through data, likes, all this kind of stuff is very precious, and it's getting collected by these platforms. So, okay, we kind of know where we're going now a little better. I want to say one thing. This is just a little, go into a little bit of what we mean when we say healthier collective sense making. Like, why do we think that Stigmergic markers could be harnessed for healthier collective sense making? So let's try to give a little more insight on like what is healthier, unhealthier, information comments. So yeah, we can look at a few examples, just like the toy example of ants, I think maybe can be illustrative. This is kind of the mental model I had in my mind as I was thinking about this paper. So, if you're looking at healthy Stigmergy in ants, so an ant, finds some food source and they start bringing it back to the nest, they lay the pheromone trail, that line there. Sorry for the poor graphics. And other ants are going to see that trail, be attracted to it, and follow it. The food source is consumed, and meanwhile the pheromone trail is decaying as the food source is consumed. Eventually, just decays, and then no ants are going to go there. They don't need to waste the time because there's no more food there. That's kind of how the healthy sort of pheromones. So pheromones decay, the ground, holds them for some time, and then there's the sort of predictable operating characteristics of it. Now imagine a different kind of setup where you have the different kind of ground, right? Like here, I'm using platform just to be suggestive, but you have a platform which is actually like swallowing pheromone. Okay, so now ants are trying to lay the pheromone, but it's kind of decaying, right? So this is already one way in which the Stigmergic infrastructure is not healthy because, in a sense, like the ants are going to find the food because they're just not going to be able. They're not going to be able to lay the pheromone there to attract other ants. Another thing that could happen is, platforms are over amplifying signals. So if this kind of ground, instead of decaying predictably, it was kind of for some reason reacting and over amplifying pheromones. So even when the food source was consumed, ants would still be kind of traversing and wasting their time even when there's no food there. So another thing, you can kind of see the parallels in light spaces. A third thing you might think of is a case where you have kind of areas where you can't lay pheromones. You can't leave the pheromone trail. So if there's food that's outside the area where you can leave pheromone, then ants won't be finding it because just the properties of the ground. So these are all kinds of ways in which there's just trying to give you the sort of convey the intuition that it's a very sort of delicately tuned system, and there are many ways that it can be out of tune, and which would lead to very disastrous consequences for the sort of organism, the collective organism as a whole. Will, did you want to say about that?
I was just going to observe that looking back on the concept of sort of information silos that you discussed with Fox News and CNN, maybe one more aspect of unhealthy Stigmergy is some of these Stigmergic markers or trails are visible to one group and invisible to another group. So you also have this failure to create a shared reality. I wonder if that's another aspect of unhealthy Stigmergy.
Yeah, definitely. I think that would definitely be another great example where you might have pheromones that only a certain part of the hive is going to be sensing, and then another type that only another part of the hive is going to be sensing. They're really going to be just living in not shared realities. For sure. So I think that's a great example also. So yeah, those are just a few kind of hand wavy intuitive examples to try to get the point across that if we're looking at healthier information environments, they're going to be highly complex because as you can see, there are a lot of parameters here. Just imagine what's going on in the web. Like, this is ants, so it's relatively simple, and even that we know is complex. But you have all these different kinds of markers people are leaving, and the different parameters to each of the markers and how they're getting spread and used to recommend content. So a lot of parameters here. The point is that as designers and participants in these information environments, we'll need to be able to assume more control, more decentralized control, right? Because we don't want a central designer, but we'll need to be able to sort of play with these parameters more. And currently, as we discussed, there's the opacity and centralization. So very few people are able even to make the kind of, to tweak these parameters, and they can do experiments, on like global scale, and they're the only people that can do them. So yeah, that was the point of these examples. So our proposals. So finally, we can kind of talk about where we think fruitful direction would be to go. Yeah, we call it open source attention, and we try to draw the parallel to open source software and decentralization movement. And the sort of, as I was alluding to earlier, they're all about freeing, most of the work up until now has been about freeing content creation and sharing. So you have things like GitHub and decentralized currencies like Bitcoin. All those are examples of the kind of semitectonic Stigmergic, the content creating Stigmergic. So we can create code, we can create documents, we can publish social media posts, all that kind of thing. That's content. We're talking about open source attention. We're looking at sort of the complement to that, the Stigmergic markers. Is anyone looking at this idea of freeing the reactions to content? So we're doing a lot of this kind of work on decentralizing content creation, but what we were kind of the aha moment was like, we're not actually doing much work on freeing these kind of reactions to content. So on the technical level, we think that just as we have sort of systems and platforms that will help us, or protocols that will help us share content, we need the same for sharing reactions to content. That's on the technical level, like at a high level. And then we have here sort of just like the social aspect of the open source software movement was these kind of hacker heroes that were building code in public and sharing it without sort of any monetary compensation. Then we'll have a similar kind of, we envision kind of a similar kind of Sensemaker hero that are sort of the counterpart, and they're doing kind of curation in public, and they're mindful of their digital attention traces. So they're doing kind of open source attention, open source thinking, sort of following these lines of open source coding that the hackers are doing. Yeah, so let's look at what open source attention means for like information ecosystems, like how we translate that to information ecosystem. Now we can actually, we're zooming in now, we're getting into the sort of more in the direction of like concrete implementation. So first, let's understand like the platform-centric information ecosystem with all the new terms we have, the new terminology. So what we can see, like, okay, so these are the dragons that are hoarding our attention data, and how it happens is we have these kind of, now we can sort of see what's happening here. The doom scrolling we're doing here is kind of a low agency annotation interface that's collecting our Stigmergic markers. Platforms are storing this data, they sell it to advertisers, they use it to drive content discovery in a way that sort of is optimizing for platform growth by serving us new content that'll keep us on our screens, as well as ads that'll keep the advertisers happy. So they can sort of, this is the feedback loop, right? They have this, they have the control loop closed on us because they have the data and they have the algorithms that are serving content. Now, how might you like do something alternative that doesn't involve those dragon platforms? So what we propose is a decentralized maker-centric ecosystem. So instead of users, we have makers, and makers are these kind of high agency annotators. So you can think of all these personal knowledge management tools, Notion and Ronen, and we'll look at VIO hopefully later, Next, all these different kinds of annotation interfaces people are building, these knowledge management tools. You can actually think of them as annotation interfaces that are collecting Stigmergic markers. But the crucial sort of point is that we're talking about a case where makers are owning these markers. This is the point of sort of self-sovereign storage, self-sovereign data. You have things like solid protocol that allow people to actually control and own their own data. And we're saying if we apply this to Stigmergic markers, we actually get this separation, decoupling of the content discovery algorithms and the Stigmergic markers. And then you kind of break up this platform loop. And then content discovery services will need to be sort of focused. They'll need to be aligned with the, take into account the sort of human-centered incentives. So makers will be able to share data with these content discovery services, and there'll be a lot of diverse content discovery services, but they won't have control over our data. And then that's kind of a way to break up that vicious cycle. So you can imagine, different kinds of feed algorithms that you'll have like a competing market of feed algorithms, or you'll have matchmaking services, you'll have AI recommendation, all kinds of diverse new discovery services, and you can use all of them or any of them, and that kind of it incentivizes an open source, open source and more human-centered environment than what we were looking at previously. Right. One of the main challenges, this is like one of the first challenges that this kind of proposal is running into, is how to scale up, because we have this kind of network effect where we need to compete essentially with Facebook and Twitter and all these huge established networks, because they have the data to provide the high quality recommendation, and we don't have anything right now. So the idea here is to bootstrap growth in personal knowledge management tools for collective knowledge management. And this is an idea that's kind of been floating around in a lot of different spaces, but yeah, this kind of feeling that user-curated knowledge is really stuck in single-player tools, and all the while, search engines really aren't doing as well as they could be doing. How do we build more collectively curated knowledge networks, and not just like these siloed second grade? So I think one way to look at it is that, from going this is swinging the pendulum in the other direction, where if previously there was data silos in the platform level, so each platform is like a data silo, and they're using that for harmful sort of purposes. This kind of problem is here. What's currently happening is like each of these small, relatively small knowledge management tools is going to be a data silo, and they won't be large enough to sort of reach critical mass. They won't be large enough to provide high quality content discovery. So they have some data, but it's not enough. So all of them are competing versus each other. None of them are going to be able to provide like this kind of high enough quality service, and they won't be able to beat the platforms, the big platforms. So what we kind of propose here is a protocols, not platforms approach, and this is something that's very sort of widely advocated for in Web3. So you see protocols for all kinds of sort of interoperable online objects, and what we're talking about here are protocols for Stigmergic primitives. So you might imagine a protocol for like or backlink or other kinds of things we talked about earlier, and that what this effectively would enable is having markers. Being able to, you could share markers essentially. So instead of having these silos of markers, you can actually pool them. So if I'm collecting my reading list in Notion, someone else is doing it in Roam, and someone else is doing it in another app, they could all sort of be shared in this common format and used for driving this content discovery. So that is kind of where we're envisioning it going. We took a lot of inspiration from this very good essay on protocols, not platforms. Highly recommend it. So yeah, I think kind of the meme version of that is we have these kind of current situation where these small independent platforms are going to be eaten by the big fish, TikTok and Twitter and Facebook and all those. And the way for these independent platforms to coordinate is through interoperability using protocols for Stigmergic markers. That's kind of our vision, but yeah, there's a lot of work to do to get to there. So some next steps we are thinking about are definitely kind of going deeper into the weeds. There are a lot of questions remaining about social incentives, the tech stack, malicious use of these kind of technologies, cultural transitions, like how do we do the transition from users to makers. This kind of work that this kind of paper was more like a blue sky idea paper, and it was more like functioning as a call to action to the sort of challenge of, we're saying we need to start building tech for governing our attention, which is sort of something that we haven't heard much talked about. So we wanted to sort of bring that, emphasize that in this paper. Yeah, we are really looking for all kinds of collaborators. So check out our website and connect with us if any of this interests you. I think we can, yeah, maybe pause there and open for discussion.
Awesome.
Any questions?
Thanks for the presentation, Ronen. So for those who are watching live, feel free to write a comment in the live chat. Otherwise, Will, if you have any reflections or thoughts, and then we have a few more slides to go through in this next steps phase, and that'll include looking a little bit more at some platform affordances and also talking about how this connects to active inference.
No immediate thoughts here. Plenty to talk about when we get to the discussion and the questions.
Yeah, let's go to the promising directions and talk about that, and then we'll go after that to VO and then active inference.
Yeah, great. So yeah, some promising directions. We kind of became aware of, this was actually even after we wrote the paper. This is an interesting work from a few years back on opportunities and challenges around public web activity tracking. So essentially getting people to like experiment with human subjects and explored the kind of affordances for allowing people to share browsing activity traces. For example, like URLs they visited and time spent on each web page and information like that. So they gave people a tool that would allow them to do that inside the browser, and they checked like small groups of people, different kind of friend groups or research groups. And what they found a lot of interesting things. I think some of the highlights were that they found that like while people had privacy concerns, they definitely can and will tailor their sharing depending on the context and incentives. People felt that this made them a lot more mindful of their browsing behavior, and a lot of times in a good way, which kind of speaks to the user to maker transition. If people are sort of being open source, just like you write open source code, you kind of make sure it's like high quality because you know people are looking at it. So staying maybe with like attention and browsing. And people also could kind of feel how this would help them better sort of navigate the information landscape, because they were saying like you can better assess the legitimacy of some website by knowing how many people visited it, and who visited it, and this kind of shared public information. Yeah, this quote kind of caught my eye. Yeah, if you ask me, I would rather, for 1,000 a billion times, that researchers for an academic and humanistic knowledge purposes are the ones that can map information store for humanity rather than private companies. So this is really speaking kind of to people feeling that sort of human-curated search, humans for humans, can be healthier information environments. Definitely, this work also pointed to sort of the limitations. It's like, how do we scale up to something larger than just like a group of friends? So yeah, but definitely this is like a cool preliminary study. Yeah, VO, we have also definitely a very interesting kind of preliminary work that Will can tell us more about.
Yeah, thanks, Ronen. So VO is it's a prototype stage software project that was actually originally designed to be a platform that is a kind of knowledge garden, a way for people to visually build their network of references and make connections and trace their paths back. And it was, in a sense, a way of creating trails for people between pieces of content in different platforms or silos. And of course, the problem with that, as Ronen has discussed, is it itself is in a silo and is in a platform. So it's a little bit self-defeating. It's in its original conceptualization. So right now we're actually in a stage where we're sort of going back to the drawing board, taking this new research and this new approach of building a tool that works on an interoperable protocol using distributed data instead of a centralized data store with proprietary mechanisms of interaction. And hopefully we can take VIO and make it a test case where we can practically apply the concept of this common sense protocol to build out a piece of software where the data can then be used in other pieces of software, other front ends, other search engines, and so on. And in that way, start to actually break free of this platforms dominate our attention paradigm and see kind of what the possibilities and limitations are. We have a short demo that is kind of the original concept of VIO. So we'll go through that real quick.
Maybe I'll put it on I think there's sound. I'll show you.
I don't think the sound will play, but just full screen the video and just play it, and Will describe us. Yeah, okay, I got it.
Yeah. If you want to describe Will, you can kind of say what we're seeing here.
All right. So this is an example of how VIO might work. So it takes you through a process of discovery. You can essentially keep track of what you're interested in learning, go through the entire search process, look for sources that seem interesting or relevant to you. And then as you go, you can go through and annotate different pieces, take detailed notes, take excerpts, etc. And then as you have new questions, as there are new areas that you would like to search, you can essentially capture those as you go without breaking your train of thought, without breaking your research process. And then from there, VIO automatically builds a visual map of what you've explored and what you have yet to explore, so that you can continue to build an ongoing research map. And then when you come back to this many months later, you have the entire context of your whole research process visually laid out for you. Everything you looked for, everything you found, everything you were interested in but never got around to. So you kind of take a lot of the burden of manually managing your research process off of the researcher and allow the technology to do what the technology does best. So largely this is just a way for you to take kind of a walk at your own pace through the information you're interested in or is valuable to you at the level that you can understand it. So it allows you to sort of self-select the best learning path without really getting lost in the platforms and algorithms and I guess content suggestions or even curated content or courses that might not be at the proper level of depth for where you are at the moment. So go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, did you want something, Dan?
Well, go first, Ronen, and then I'll add a few notes.
I just wanted to say that like this is I mean, this was one of the things that sort of I think triggered the whole collaboration and like got us started on this direction of research. Like seeing what VIO can, like VIO does I think a few intriguing things. Like one is that many annotation tools don't provide this kind of temporal relation between annotations. So they're just like you're annotating everything and you don't really know the structure of like how you got there and where you went from there. And seeing this like laid out in a trail form was really evocative and the sort of thinking about like how would this look if we could share this kind of information, and like imagining the sort of multiplayer VIO where you might be standing on a node and then you're like seeing the trails of other people, and maybe it's like even using AI to sort of highlight the people that are maybe recommended that you should follow their trails based on Stigmergic and crowd signals and AI or whatever. So like that was very like that was like a moment of like wow, that would be an amazing tool to have as you're navigating the web. And yeah, one other thought there about I think those are the three things I wanted to say. Like social VIO and the sort of linking annotations are like seem like really, really intriguing directions to take this.
Yeah, I also saw that transition between the first person knowledge management and the second person that Ronen had brought up earlier, and it hinges on shared landmarks. And so being able to think of these in a spatial context, which maybe we can return to with active inference, and then being able to go down to just one's own path, like just like we'd have a trace on a Google Maps or something like that, but then see multiple paths together and have curation approaches there. And then I think it's really it's a fascinating tension with this functionality, the single or the multiplayer case. It could be done in a centralized platform Web 2 strategy. And there's even arguments for why that would be streamlined, more efficient, more secure, all these different aspects. Yet, in a different way or at a higher level, there are challenges and failure modes and so on that would be like dismantling the function potentially. For example, allowing for a centralized point of control over those path recommendation algorithms. So as long as the architecture is bundled, then there are certain failure modes that this is actually like escalating to the next level. People say, oh, we used to have the news feed, it was linear, and now we have the branching news feed, and it's so much more fun and engaging, but then it's just representing the next escalation in attention capture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good observation.
Yeah.
And
oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's kind of why we're motivated to pull out of this platform paradigm and kind of follow this this new approach. Because fundamentally, like all we're trying to do is enhance people's ability to make sense of the world. And if we make a tool that undermines it, no matter how cool or fun it is, we we failed. So bringing it into a context where this data is, you can take the same data and use it in different apps, or you can take data from different apps and use it in here, and you can kind of break free of certain mechanisms where the fact that the data is siloed could be used against the end user, and instead create a paradigm where this information can be acted on and interpreted in a lot of different ways, where there's room for innovation and insights and creativity and competition and disruption, where this model can be evolved outside of just this app by one team of developers, and can be integrated into different ways of interacting with information. And by freeing it from that, then the concept isn't only serving a business or a small group of people. It's serving everybody who stands to benefit from the concept being available. So that's kind of what we're trying to do. We don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot and
in the collective
violate our purpose. Yeah.
I was just thinking, just one more thought. I was thinking of like you were talking about the different kinds of apps. Like, I mean, by letting this data be free, it opens up like the space of like, you don't really know how it can be used. I mean, we know it's incredibly valuable. We can't even envision like how it could be used in different ways. I was just thinking of, for example, you know, like learning apps. I think there's like a lot of intriguing space there to explore. Like, you know, the trail that someone is making in the beginning of their steps in some topic is very different than the trail that someone is making like an advanced trail. And you could, if you could, you know, learn these different kinds of trails, you could build like really cool online curriculum services. That's one thing I was thinking of, but there's just like so many others. And I think there's just a lot of questions, you know, people are maybe thinking to themselves like, yeah, I mean, obviously there's technical questions, because what we're saying here, just to kind of drive the point home, we're saying we don't think Veo should be the only tool that will let you map these rabbit holes. We want a lot of different tools to be able to do this and interoperate with each other. That's one thing that's kind of okay, because it raised a lot of confusing questions about, you know, okay, how do you guys monetize this stuff? And like, where's the data getting stored, and how are people not stealing your data, or how are you maybe getting compensated for people using your data in different kinds of services? So we're aware that there are a lot of challenging questions there. Like, we're not naive about that, but we do think that these kind of questions are joining, you know, broader questions in Web3 space of data sovereignty and decentralized identity, and all those bigger questions that a lot of people are working on, and we see ourselves sort of interfacing with them, and, you know, in a modular way. Like, if someone has a good solution for, you know, remunerating people on their data creation, then we can kind of draw from that and learn from that and apply it here too.
Let's
we can move on to the
Yep, bring it to active inference, and maybe go to the second of the active inference slides first.
How do I get out of this? Let me see.
Awesome.
Well, let's get back here. Awesome.
And the next slide. We'll come back to the general questions, but I just wanted to start with this one, highlight some awesome recent work and provide like an example-based entry point to the intersection of attention, which is often used very abstractly or in a single entity case in active inference, or in a non-stigmergic setting, how attention is being used, and bring it to like a very clear applied case. So this is the recent work of Albarracin et al. From this year, and they are making a model of kind of like a toy Twitter, where individuals are involved in, just like in any active inference model, they're involved in perception, cognition, and action, and then impact in the niche. And in this case, what is being perceived from the niche, what the generative process is handing those entities, is information that in this case is being proxied by different hashtags. So, yes on X, no on X. Of course, hashtags have a much more complex usage, simply tagging content or using or not using. One can see many ways that the hashtag is not the whole semantic picture, but again, it serves as a proxy and as an expansible platform to make models that could include different kinds of communication. And on the left is a graphical representation of how this simulation plays out. And so a simulation like this can be used prospectively, given a set of parameters to evaluate different futures. It can also be used given empirical data to tune those parameters. And in fact, there can be kind of a bidirectionality or a tale of two cities, tale of two densities, where empirical data are coming in and updating parameters. And then those updated parameters are used in a generative capacity, again, to look at counterfactuals or to simulate futures. And it's called a graphical model because it's based upon a Bayesian graphical network model. The nodes, whether they're a circle or a square, there's some details to go into, but the nodes are variables. So that would be like X equals, those are the nodes. And that would be equivalent to like a variable in a script. So whether you think about this more mathematically or more from a programming and implementation angle, the nodes are like the variables and the edges represent relationships amongst the variables. And for those who have more familiarity with this type of representation of an active inference model, they'll see what some of these letters mean and what roles they might be playing here. But suffice to say that this graphical network here is representing the cognitive context of multiple entities that are receiving information in the form of hashtag, doing some cognitive process on it, updating their beliefs, as well as choosing how to act, and then implementing that action. And then that is like one time step in the simulation. So I wanted to provide this example because it's a great case study of bringing active inference into a social and digital setting. And it's a great direction that uses also the PyMDP package developed by some of the authors and others. So it's a great case on multiple sides to understand how research developments and open source software development can meet up with socially relevant cases. So wanted to just describe that case. If either of you have any thoughts or questions, and then the next case that we'll look into will be more of an ant case, and that'll help bring us to some of these bigger questions about attention and Stigmergic.
Yeah, I was just going to say, this kind of circles back, I think, to the one of the first slides we were talking about is this kind of stewardship of global collective behavior paper, which was kind of, calling out the fact that there's no ethical or scientific oversight over the large platforms, and then saying this is something like how oversight might look. And actually, it's more than oversight, right? Because actually, it's even deeper than oversight, because it's actually like you might imagine this being involved in sort of intervention in platforms, sort of being able to sort of, if you have recommendation services, this could like inform how to update parameters, the recommendation service based on observed behavior of the network. So yeah, beyond oversight, even sort of like this kind of collective decentralized control we were alluding to. So I think this is like a more concrete instance of how that might look. Very fascinating kind of direction, a modeling direction that people can maybe find interesting.
And it also really highlights the relevance of a bottom-up agentic perspective, not just because we then can talk about pluralism and diversity of perspectives much more easily, but even the kinds of design interventions and suggestions are going to be different if we think about this from like the top-down content depositing or the bottom-up approach. Like imagine if we wanted the ants in the colony to be in a different location, and we're putting all these articles in one location, we're making so much amazing content promoting this idea. But of course, if the entities are not navigating to it and reinforcing that trail, you could spend all the money on advertising and it would just dissipate as soon as that like life support for the trail were gone. And so when we take that bottom up attention-based perspective, it really puts us like in the view from the inside, from the participant. What are they perceiving, which is always going to be extremely limited? And then what are they updating their beliefs in terms of? And then how are they choosing to act given the affordances they have? So the bottom-up perspective brings in all these very important discussions around like accessibility in discourse and perspective integration, and then treats it as like something that might be addressed at the level where it's occurring, which is at the entity or the actor level, rather than being like, well, there's 500 petabytes of data, and this is how much the system does on this high level. Those are abstract metrics. Again, with an economic analogy, it'd be like macroeconomics and then behavioral and like neuro and microeconomics. One can just put piles of product in different locations, but unless there's individuals who are interested in it and prefer it and allocate their attention to it, nothing will occur.
And maybe another, just like to try a concrete like example for that could be, Will brought up this the dashboard, the Fox News versus CNN. So you might imagine like stewards of some futuristic social network or look at the kind of attention data that we're talking about collecting here. And they might be able to, through these kind of modeling approaches, suggest, okay, what if we want to optimize this network for, breadth of coverage and like get people to see diverse viewpoints and stuff like that. Like which recommendation services we use and how should we tune them? And then sort of seeing the effect of that and being able to sort of learn how to collectively steward attention. And, again, this is open source, people can participate in it. In directions that are more healthy for society. And
then one last thought before going to the next slide is, in the VO traces, we saw about how what was being presented or provided or curated wasn't necessarily the granular content. So not the newsletter that says, here's the 5 things you want to look at, or here ranked by whatever metric, novelty, or by importance or popularity. Here are the granular atomic pieces of content for you to look at. When we can curate and in a consensual way determine how transitions amongst content are coming into play, that's like the true value. Okay, so you're on the Wikipedia page for active inference, or you're on the Wikipedia page for some historical entity. Maybe that content is just so amazing it stands alone, but the reality is it's part of our epistemic foraging, our learning journeys. And so being able to connect dots is quite literally understanding, okay, for somebody who is in a given context and language experience, this intro to Python should link to this next resource. But then, of course, there's many links. So there's no reason to collapse that pathway to like a hallway. It kind of respects the actual dynamics of the information environment in a few interesting ways. Let's go to the next slide because it connects up some more points. Yeah.
The back ones or backwards or forwards?
The forwards.
Cool.
Okay, so in 2021, with some colleagues, I worked on a ant colony simulation where the individual nestmates were utilizing an active inference model of perception, cognition, action, and those actions were spatial movement in a T maze, so in a foraging space. And then one other action that they had the opportunity to do upon finding food was to deposit pheromone. So no pheromone was being deposited until the food was detected, and then upon kind of turning around, a pheromone deposition occurred, and it was decaying in the environment. Now, it's a kind of fun link to look at the place where that core model of epistemic foraging, being foraging in a space and looking for something, seeking for something, having a preference to find something, that we used in the ant spatial foraging case for finding the food resource in the T-maze. It was adapted from a earlier / different paper by Axel Constant et al. And the paper was Acquisition of Culturally Patterned Attention Styles under Active Inference. And so the setting is very creative and subtle, which is that there's a tic-tac-toe grid. So a 3x3 grid that is representing like the visual scope of someone who's looking at something. So they're staring or they're foveating on the central point, and then they have like a limited range of peripheral vision. And then outside of that, there's much less visual acuity. They were involved in an epistemic foraging task. So unlike where in reward learning, the decisions of where to move and how to move might be dictated by what is perceived as the most pragmatically rewarding state or paths towards pragmatic reward. In this information foraging case, which has been also explored in a lot of other eye movement active inference simulations, it's driven by epistemic foraging, reducing uncertainty about what kind of pattern one is existing in. And so it's almost like reading Braille, except it's with our eyes, because we, of course, don't see at the same resolution the whole page at the same time. In fact, the clarity outside of your main visual region and the clarity even in your blind spot is part of our generative model of vision. But putting that aside, what the entities are doing in this pottery scanning task is actually scanning locally and using the local patterns that they're seeing with the relationship of like, okay, is it like a line going across or a line going up, or is there a diagonal? Understanding the motifs that they're perceiving to reduce their uncertainty about what kind of pottery they're looking at. And this, the only main tweak that we had to make to bring it into a spatial foraging context was thinking, okay, instead of the point at the center of the visual gaze, instead of that just being like the XY coordinate of where one is looking at, we're going to make that the body position of the nestmate. And so visual foraging, you can scan and you can like teleport or move very rapidly, but it doesn't leave a trace. You could look over something many times and it's not going to modify the object. In the ant case, because it's this embodied spatial foraging, they are only able to move locally, and they do, under all/some situations, physically modify the niche. And I think it really closes the loop with what Ronen brought up earlier with like eye gaze and other brain-computer interfaces are taking invisible stigmergic markers of attention and making them into visible markers, like heat gaze analysis or heat maps of gaze. Not sure what they call it. It is often used like in advertising, where people might present two versions of a page or a product and see where people are looking in terms of the label and other features. Do we have or use that kind of approach for education? Do we proactively use it? Do people field test different layouts of papers? So that's an interesting thought. And
well, yeah, I
just wanted to go there.
Yeah, I definitely feel like the whole, I was thinking just like, it feels like a whole new sort of, field of epistemic engineering. Like there's so many, there's both like at the, theory, engineering, practice. They're all at all the different levels. There's just like, it seems like pretty wide blue ocean space for different kind of techniques modeling. This is really cool. I like how you bridge between site, like the site where we have here, like the foliation and the ant movement. Like it's really interesting, like how each ant is sort of like a sensor of the collective organism. So yeah, it almost felt like what we're trying to build then for social networks. It's kind of like we're trying to build like a seismograph or something like that, like a epistemic seismograph. By making this kind of what you're saying, like the invisible Stigmergic visible or more visible.
Or another kind of visual mixed metaphor, if there's a top-down attention determiner, it's like the Eye of Mordor in Lord of the Rings. It's like a laser that's like leaving like a scar where it's scanning. So it could be modifying the environment or not, but it's like one strong laser versus like seeing it as like many distributed eyes that are in local feedback loops. So their cognitive burden, if we think about the actual biology of it, or their computational burden, if we think about simulating this system, would be lower and more parallelizable and wouldn't require any entity to have access to information that we know it can't have. Like, how do people interact with markets? Well, they don't have the time series data from the last 10 years loaded into memory, but the analyst might. But the individual is actually on this journey, seeing random things from different times. And so if we wanted to understand decision making in that setting, we would want to be taking, or at least complementing, the top down with a bottom up view. And so it's the case in economics, and it's also the case in our epistemic environments, though those are corralled in a way that keeps the discourse on certain areas.
Yeah, we kind of talked about this a little before. I feel like there's another whole rabbit hole to talk about how this kind of how much we want to bring in this sort of machine-aided decision making, because we understand that like humans, like on one sense, I can see where you're going with like the sort of how local agents are making sense of their local environments, and that's sort of creating this more global sense making. But then we also know that humans, like when we choose, for example, what path on this like social via we were imagining, like we're going to use AI to sort of integrate histories of people that have traversed those paths and like decide, here suggest like a few to go on. So I think there's just this delicate balance between maintaining human agency and interpretability, that like know what they're doing, they're not just like following blindly set instructions from algorithms. Versus really needing algorithms to make sense and crunch the data, but doing it in a way that doesn't sort of I think that I've heard it called algorithms that disintermediate humans. That like it's kind of like the human is like a peripheral part of the sense making loop, and that it's mostly between algorithms. So yeah, I think there's definitely like a delicate walk there.
Let's go to the first active inference slide, and then so we have kind of two slides of general questions to raise. Some of them to bring us out from those more specific examples, some general active inference questions, and then we can close with the open challenges. So just the first one was, what is attention in active inference and how is it being used? Because there's a technical usage of attention that's common in Bayesian statistics. Like you could hear about a neural network with an attention module, or even a simpler kind of model with attention as a parameter. And it relates to how much new observations are updating your priors. So if you have no attention on an observation, it's not updating your priors. So that is equivalent to not paying attention. It's like there's things you're not seeing behind you. You're not paying any attention. They're not being used to update your priors. Whereas if you're super paying attention to something, then you're going to be updating your priors to its location or what it's telling you. So where have we seen that kind of motif in active inference? And how did it play a role in the Albarracin et al. Paper? And how does it play a role in these kinds of simulations? Second question is like a very general question that we ask all the time, which is just where and how is active inference being applied? Are those conceptual or schematic simulations? Or are these real-time data processing systems, which almost inevitably are going to require technical solutions that aren't like just the active inference entity loop. That's kind of like the kernel, but then there's a technological system that uses the kernel, just like the linear model kernel, like y equals mx plus b. That is so simple, it can be written down. Yet in practice, there needs to be a lot of architecture and multilinear regressions and so on. So this is a different kernel for modeling this kind of an active situation. And also the systems need to have more than just an insightful kernel to be of any utility, let alone function. The third point, we recently had a symposium on active inference and robotics, where we had about 9 presenters who shared different work that is involving the realization of robotic systems implementing active inference. And to see the kinds of topics that they were bringing to the front, like affective robotics, robots that are dealing with us as affective entities, but also robots that even have computational emulations of affect. Like, what if a robot could have a frustration parameter, but it used that to not go down a road that it wasn't really finding value in, for example, or boredom if the information wasn't good, or excitement if it were good. So those kinds of affects have a technical and computational usage in active inference models. And then I think the last question that brings us to the more open questions and a lot of the other threads that our co-authors have been bringing in is like, where is design in this, and human-centered design, graphical design, and the user interface, but taking that as like the tip of the iceberg, and how do we bring in proactive thinking around what kinds of systems and experiences that are to be curated? How does that design thinking meld with cognitive science in a positive way?
Cool. Yeah, one thing you mentioned, I think this was in the beginning when we started working on this research. You asked this question, it kind of stuck with me. You said something about like, yeah, we have, like, what are we doing with all the cognitive science theories if we're not using them? Like you were saying something to the effect that, like, yeah, we're not implementing the theories in practice, like often when we're building products. So it seems, yeah, this seems like a really interesting kind of theory integrating with practice to build, yeah, information landscapes. Yeah, very, very, I think cognitive science has a lot to say here. And yeah, I'm excited to see how this gets kind of integrated.
I like how it kind of gets a little meta too. So you have, I liked what you said earlier. You said epistemic engineering. I'm kind of inclined to reframe it as like epistemic design, epistemic environment design, in which agents are using their understanding of active inference to develop systems that allow individuals to interact with the world in a way that best uses active inference. So it's sort of like, and I mean, that's kind of what I believe that I've heard it phrased as active open-mindedness. That's a sort of like self-reflection. It's this ability to evaluate your own cognitive processes, update your models in your own cognitive processes in ways that allow you to interact with other external information so that you can continue to update your models where they might otherwise become entrenched in overconfidence and confirmation bias and whatnot. And this is kind of taking it out of that individualistic paradigm and applying it in a collective paradigm where you're by designing ecosystems, epistemic ecosystems that allow people to best leverage those innate qualities without even thinking about it. We're kind of reaping the same benefit to some extent that people would gain from like deep, somewhat critical, or at least humble and skeptical introspection, which is active inference applied to itself in a sense.
Yeah, maybe it is pretty meta, which I think is really cool. And I just to maybe try to connect it to some things people might be familiar with. I think Tristan Harris often speaks about like the sort of current technology, which is sort of race to the bottom, that it keeps like, it sort of thrives on exploiting our different vulnerabilities, cognitive vulnerabilities, and profiting off those. But at the sort of, the externality is that, we're degrading human cognition. Here, this really, I feel like we're in this sort of trying to be in a space of race to the top, which is another kind of saying that Tristan Harris, I've heard him talk about, where, trying to think about technology in a way that, it's actually making us more open-minded, more attuned to sort of our space and the collective, like where we fit in like collective sense making. And it seems like it's really racing. How do we build technology to make people more, critically reflective and open-minded and all those things. And we have to apply those same principles to do it. We have to understand those things. We have to know what open-mindedness means to be able to sort of build technology that will help bring it about. That's the meta.
Maybe a last ActInf comment was, we'll go to our last slide, is like, Will, what you mentioned with active open-mindedness, which is surely a term that preceded active inference, but it foresages that active engagement and then the dilemma or tension or dialectic between like what we bring to the table and then what the table is providing to us. And so if it were some other kind of product design, we're making a soft drink, are we going to barge in with assumptions? And then what are the danger modes of that? But also, what is the danger of just what every single person tells you, putting too much attention on the specifics, overfitting to those 20 people and making some kind of like chimera that only appeals to them? And that would be one thing in the food engineering and food design case. But this is the leverage point on digital communication. And so it becomes even more of an immediacy, because this is like the coefficient on how we communicate and share and learn nowadays. And also like puts in these higher order questions like we were talking about earlier, which is there's always going to be an argument for centralization. And that's not to say that one extreme is better than another. It's always contextual, but there always is an argument to just do it faster internally rather than potentially avert a deeper failure mode. But there are other challenges arising with decentralized systems. So there's no generalized free lunch, but then the question could be like, but could there be information environments and regimes of action and regimes of attention that are consensual and also productive and so on? So I agree. It's been an awesome, and to bring in, Will, with yours and Lauren's experience on design and seeing design as like almost the art and science and practice of bringing the counterfactual and the adjacent possible via inference into something that is implemented. So I think there's a lot to connect there. So maybe let's go to our last slide, and then if anybody in the live chat has any thoughts or questions, otherwise, Ronen, looking forward to hearing these.
Just stamps. So, the epistemic design, I think, is it feels like there's the whole like full stack epistemics. Like there's design, engineering, there's all the and in between. So we were talking about some of the sort of trade-offs between, I think, where we are now and centralized systems and decentralized systems. There are a lot of open challenges here. Some of them we kind of already talked about, so I'll go through them. But I just kind of finish on some of these things that we're looking at as we try to make progress with our research proposal and development and all that. I think one thing is definitely that we're in sort of what can we do right now to help clean up our information ecosystems, given that many of these tools don't exist yet, and then they're sort of, I guess a lot of people would say these are like it could be decade-long project to build these kind of interoperable protocols. What do we do right now? I think if anyone has thoughts on that, I think that'd be great. Feel free to raise those. Otherwise, I'll run through them all. If you have thoughts, we can go back to it. I think there's this kind of, we talked about this a few times during the conversation. You have this kind of user, which is the local minima convenience. Users are just like, they're getting used and they're using software, but it's really like this kind of very convenient local minima and we get stuck in it. How do we transition towards more active Sensemaker role? There's a lot of sort of culture and norms and social aspects here that we can definitely also dive deeper into, but yeah, probably have future conversations on that. And yeah, there's also the protocol problem, which we're mindful of, where this is, I think, best expressed by this XKCD comic. You have some kind of situation where you want to introduce a new standard, but they're already standards. Then you kind of try to generalize everyone else's protocols, and now there's like 15 protocols. And you're stuck in the same situation. Yeah, this is a problem. I don't know any like really great results. I'm not aware of so many success stories here. So it is clear we have like a challenge facing us. But on the other hand, Web3 seems to be all about sort of tackling this protocol problem. So we feel like we're in good company, at least, in thinking about this. And I think, that's what we just did here.
Will, you want to add something or?
One of the things I love the second one, and I think one of the things that resonates with me is I think it speaks to one of the original explicit goals of VIO, which is like, obviously this is a huge problem, and one of the things that we were trying to do in designing that interface is to make it as convenient as possible to be an active Sensemaker. And largely this is driven by my own research process. I have ADHD. I have a very hard time getting through research papers. So I was actually, we were trying to find a way to make going through this process that seems really overwhelming to some people, including myself, a lot more convenient and a lot more simple, and taking a lot of that, like the labor burden off, so that the person's mind is free to think and record and doesn't have to actually manage really what is a fairly sophisticated process for people who, both of you are, seasoned academics. You know that it's not a trivial skill to be able to go through loads of information and extract what's meaningful and figure out where you need to delve into new arenas. And if you can make that process that requires a lot of discipline and planning and structures and whatnot, if you can make that very convenient, then all of a sudden you can just think about the thing, think about the information and the ideas that are in the information. So, of course, we don't have that tool yet. So what can we do right now?
Nice, thanks, Will. Just a few other comments. The interoperability. We brought it up earlier. The content is often highly interoperable today. Like whether you can download it directly or right-click save or use OBS to screen cap, pretty much any content can be delivered on another platform. You can share text or an image you found on one location to another. So in many ways, amidst the platforms, jumping from platform to platform, we have interoperable content because we have file types for content, JPEG. And Ronen, you highlighted the interoperability of these attention markers, the ones that we have today, the likes and so on, but then the ones that we could have tomorrow with all these other kinds of interfaces. And then I wondered, well, where are we at with financial interoperability? Is there a way for even this one special kind of data, like a ledger or some kind of bookkeeping? What are the interoperability mechanisms that exist for financial data? And then would the knowledge case be easier or harder? And then what happened, this 14 and then going to 15. So how does the financial information stay coherent with markets? There isn't an interoperability layer necessarily directly between two currencies, but then there are different kinds of intermediators who can be clear or obscure with why they're providing some kind of exchange. And so I think that points to information exchanges before some kind of sweeping knowledge generalization synthesis, like a future knowledge protocol. there would be many options for just like the APIs and the kind of web scraping and reparsing techniques that exist today to act as markets that help swap different information. And then one other point to make was we talked also about like what is opaque and what is transparent. And in some earlier ActInf streams, actually on like consciousness and attention and awareness, we had an interesting discussion around transparency and opaque. A transparent thing is something that you can't see. You see through it because you can't see it. Something that's opaque, you do see because you can't see through it. So what aspects of the system should be transparent, which isn't to say we could investigate the source code, because that would actually be opacity. And one could say, well, it's fully documented, totally comprehensive opacity. Well, that's great. But what are the parts of the system that are transparent, like the water we swim in, that would be not visible? And then what are the parts of the system where people would see them and know them, and those would be opaque?
Yeah, that's an awesome. Like that's a it's kind of mind blowing thought. That kind of brings to mind, Will's distinction on making like convenience isn't always. I was treating it here as sort of something that's kind of cursed, but he was saying that it can also be a boon or a benefit if the right thing is made convenient. And that kind of seems like what you're saying also is we need to make the right things, like just like an interface, like a cell phone, the right things are opaque and the right things are transparent. Where the affordances for controlling it, the relevant affordances for controlling it are the ones that you see. The ones that you don't need to see, you don't see. So yeah, probably something like that. It seems like again, it's epistemic design, like how to make information landscapes that sort of show you the right levers and obscure the things you don't need to see so you can not get overwhelmed. And probably being able to, and this kind of openness, the open source quality of them means that different people will want different levers. So some people will really want to play with the nuts and bolts, and other people will just want to have simple interfaces. But allowing all that span of interfaces, I think, is part of the this touched on this kind of plurality aspect you were talking about. I think it's really important that different people will see different interfaces based on what's best for them.
That's one of the biggest advantages of having this interoperability is now we have an opportunity to take what is ultimately the same data set and make interfaces, make end user applications that are tailored to particular needs or people or use cases or accessibility needs and whatnot, so that really niche groups of people can interact on this broad scale in a way that specifically suits them, that can't be accommodated with a platform or with kind of a one size fits all approach to manipulating with, engaging with, interacting with this data, this information.
Yeah.
One quick comment on the accessibility, because I think it really distinguishes the semi-tectonic, the building-like Stigmergy from the attention-like Stigmergy. So content accessibility is the prerequisite for there to be the trail. Content accessibility could include screen reader affordances, changing the font size, changing the colors, making sure that, just like the open science movement has been highlighting, that the content quite literally is accessible in any form, let alone one that accounts for sensory differences. But just making the content available has to be a first step. And then what does attention accessibility look like? So if previously it was we need that PDF accessible, not behind a paywall. Okay, content accessibility with preprint servers to a large extent in the scientific domain, just speaking narrowly, that content is accessible. And then what are all the trails that go from this one preprint website and PDF, and the way that these 700 people had these thoughts and these 300 people had these thoughts, that's that transition amongst different content and giving visibility to that content, because that content is being recorded and it is being used to shape attention, but through this covert platform owned loop, rather than us being able to like be like, I want to publicly add this comment on the paper, and then this is just, I want this to be only in my private information or something like that. But I think that really like highlights that accessibility isn't just the font size genre. There's another connecting the dots kind of accessibility that doesn't exist even like on the radar, because it feels like, well, what do you need to understand the scientific paper beyond having access to the PDF? It's like you need like everything. And now that can be a clearer conversation.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Accessibility is broader than just the content. It's accessibility to the reactions of people to the content. Yeah.
Well, any other like thoughts or directions or information you want to share, feel free to go for it.
Yeah, this was great. I mean, just really, this is fun to dive into all these things. Yeah, so many good questions. And I just again to reiterate that, it'll take a lot of minds to think about these things and work on these things, a lot of different types of minds and builders and all that. So yeah, if you're interested by any of this, then we're really welcoming collaborators.
Awesome. Yeah, we can have like a 26.2. We can always continue the series and like version and update and include others in the conversation. So great presentation, and thanks both for joining.
Thank you, Daniel, for putting this on.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Goodbye.
See ya.
There's a few things. One is to just share it and ask people, but it's an hour and a half long.